And we are happy to have you, Graham, to talk to us about book conservation and book arts, and also hear a little bit about your artistic practice. I'm going to get the presentation up, and whenever you'd like to start.
Okay, so I don't see the presentation anymore for some reason, but
Oh,
I can try to bring it up on my own screen. Oh, there we go. Looking good. Okay. Thank you, Lauren. I'm happy to be here speaking today. Um, so I am going to be speaking today from the perspective of a conservator who's been in the field just a few years and somebody who is also a book artist. So my main focus in conservation is the conservation of rare books, and I work at the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover, Massachusetts. And I also spend a lot of my other time making my own book arts. So let's see here. Yeah, that's great. So I just wanted to go over a couple of the different ways that people over time up till now have been getting into book conservation and becoming professionals. There have been sort of two main paths that people have taken. The first, more traditional path has been to start as a bookbinder, training as a bookbinder with an apprenticeship or going to a trade school such as the North Bennett Street School in Boston, where there's all sorts of trades, including bookbinding. And eventually working your way into conservation internships and apprenticeships and learning a lot of the more technical aspects of conservation on the job. And that's what a lot of people in the field call bench trained conservators. So the other main way is actually starting in conservation and then picking up all sorts of aspects of bookbinding along the way. And that is more what we see nowadays, although you definitely see a lot of mix. In any given lab, you'll see a mix of both directions, and that's really great. They really complement each other. Stronger bookbinding background or a stronger science background, for example. So on the next slide, you can see that there are a number of programs available for studying conservation at the graduate level these days, including the program that I went through with the Buffalo State College Art Conservation Department. And we kind of think of three main programs that are your basic core art conservation programs: the Buffalo, New York, the Winterthur program at Delaware, and the New York University program. And then there's also the various others that you see here, which go into some other types of historic preservation or ethnographic materials. For all of these programs, there are a lot of prerequisites needed to get into the programs in studio art, art history, and science, mainly chemistry. And then once you've gone through these programs, or sometimes you're able to, during these programs, learn a lot of bookbinding and book practice along the way. And that is how I did it. So there were various workshops and internships that I was able to do during the programs. And everyone along the way has been just really helpful. That's the main thing that I found with conservators in general. Everyone really wants to help you and guide you and share their knowledge. And together we all form a really great whole. So in the next slide, we'll just, this is Buffalo. This is where I went to school, and I'll just have that pretty picture up there for a little while I say some other things. So as I said, I went to this school, but I'll go back through my basic path. I came across book conservation as an undergraduate, and I was doing a music performance degree, actually. And I was just searching around for a job to do in college, and the library was offering a lot of jobs, and I just looked around. And I'd always been sort of a crafty person interested in arts and stuff, and so I pretty quickly latched on to the preservation job, and there were only a couple of student positions available, and so I spent my 4 years at college doing basic, pretty low-level basic repairs to circulating collections. And that exposure to books really got me interested in making books and doing book arts, and that's pretty much right away how I got into making my own book art. And so then after college, I was able to find a job in another circulating collection and spent that time during the next 4 years while I was working, completing all my prerequisites that I mentioned: science, art history, studio arts, and eventually applied to graduate programs, which include internships during the program. And once I completed the program, the next step for many people in that case is to find a fellowship at some institution. And so I completed a 2-year fellowship in conservation, sort of an entry-level first job in conservation. And it's a really fantastic bridge between graduate school and the real job world, because the lab understands that you're starting out and that you have a lot to learn, but it's your chance to really try to be a professional. So I just wanted to make a little plug now for advocacy in our field of books in general. There is a great need for conservation and conservators in general right now, but there's a lot of limited funding and limited actual opportunities. And I think that has a lot to do with an understanding of the value of conservation and an understanding of the cost as well. So I just want to try to start, spreading that understanding, because conservation is very important, but it's also very expensive. But we also understand that it's incredibly important to accomplish. And anybody in the whole field in books, librarians, archivists, conservators, really need to advocate for the importance of this to administrators and other librarians, just to really support the field, and then we can all get the work done. I just think it's important to understand that stewardship and long-term preservation are as much a part of acquiring materials as the initial cost, and people don't always understand that, and they start hoarding materials, and then you run into problems. So just understanding that there's an inherent responsibility while acquiring. Anyway, so books, I find in general occupy kind of a unique place in the range of materials found in conservation field in general. They're both objects and containers of information. So one thing that ended up being surprising to me in my path through school is how difficult it seems to be to find a workable and sustainable place in the field of educational institutions and programs for book conservation to reside. There used to be a really great program at the Texas Graduate School at Austin, Library and Information Science, and there was a conservation program attached to that for really learning the techniques of working on books physically. And unfortunately, that ended some years ago, and a kind of replacement program started up where those 3 main schools, Buffalo, Winterthur, and NYU, opted to take funding from the Mellon Foundation to have book conservation be included in the art conservation program, with an adjunct visiting professor, summer and winter workshops. And that has also seen changes, and it's interesting to me and surprising to me how difficult it is to find just the right balance and just the right place for it. Does it mesh with library and preservation training? Does it mesh more with traditional art conservation, which includes paintings and furniture and flat art on paper, photography? So that's just a tricky thing that we're all still trying to figure out. So, okay, next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk about, in my experience, as somebody who works both in conservation and works on book art, how those 2 practices influence each other. So to start with, there are decisions and techniques that I make because I'm a conservator. So with my conservation background, I think a lot more maybe about many properties and structural functions of materials, not just their appearance. we really think about every single step of everything we do in conservation. It's an extremely methodical practice. And so we consider the use of certain materials for different purposes: longevity, strength, flexibility, access to information. And what we have to think about for those things are, for example, the pH and acid content of materials, and lignin from the wood, and housing the materials. So in terms of strength and flexibility of materials, we just also just get to know materials from our experience in conservation. We have a familiarity with their folding strength, with how they should be prepared to certain thicknesses for best functionality. And um, so in terms of problem solving, in conservation, we have to do a lot of improvisational, tricky thinking to solve problems, lining materials with tissue or cloth. We have various adhesive systems that can be useful not just in conservation but in art. There are sewing styles, just controlling the behavior and movement of certain materials with moisture, adhesives. We do a lot of creative problem solving for physically awkward situations where we have to create convoluted support systems and clamping and moisture barriers and stuff that you might not necessarily think of just being an artist. And on the next slide, you can see a kind of creative clamping, tying up setup, which sort of is it's a hybrid of a traditional setup where in binding a leather book you would set the leather with cord, but because some of the original leather on this book that I'm repairing is still in place, I have to avoid certain sensitive areas. So it's just an example of how you have to do kind of convoluted workarounds sometimes. And in the next slide, I'm working on a repair. I'm sorry, I think I saw a question.
So we have a question from Sherry that says, I'm interested in understanding more about the relationship between this kind of education work and the library information science area. So I guess, do you think that there is more of a bridge that we could kind of look at rather than, I know you discussed art history and art conservation, and perhaps it's more closely related to that, but as library and information science people, do you think that this would be something that we could strive to do? Is that perhaps a correct, maybe, summarization of your question, Sherry? Yes, okay.
Great. Yeah, that is a real challenge, I think, in this field. And it's one I was speaking to before when I was talking about how sources for funding and locations, institutions where this kind of work can be done. I think it can work in a library and preservation training setting, and I think for years it did work at the Texas program. And I'm not exactly sure what the reasons were for why that dissolved funding, or I don't know, but I think it can work, and I think this is something you can strive for. But I think it has to be a full picture of what book conservation really entails as a separate entity from just preservation. They work closely together, but I think it would need to be developed as a full thing unto itself.
Right.
If
So
that makes any sense.
this would probably be something that you would decide, I would like to be a book conservator and specifically work with books, whereas maybe like as a conservator in special collections, you kind of deal with a lot of materials all at once and you have to kind of be versatile, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. Yes, yes.
Okay, and
Um,
Sherry also asks, are these programs integrated with the digital preservation area?
the three main programs that I mentioned for art conservation, into which book conservation has recently been folded, don't really focus much on digital preservation in terms of training for doing digital preservation. I think you'd find that more at preservation programs like at Simmons in Boston, which is one that I'm a little bit more familiar with, and others. Uh, So I'm less familiar with doing digital preservation myself, although the institution that I work at currently does provide that service.
I'm just going to add on to that. I do a lot of digitizing and digitization of like works on paper and books and different things, and a lot of that I learned actually in the field, not within my education within school. So it's also good to keep on your toes and look for other opportunities that can kind of supplement and complement what you're learning in school as well.
Great.
Okay,
So
back to our
next slide, I
PowerPoint.
guess. Yeah, alrighty. So here I just wanted to show another little quick example of uh, tricky little things you have to figure out on the fly to solve problems in conservation, but it's also skills that can be translated into book arts as well. So here I am actually rewinding the end band on a book and trying to create a structurally sound setup there. And it's something that I'll speak to later, that in my art, really it's hard to say which one influences the other more, conservation and book arts, because they really are hand in hand. So many conservators are also artists, and the skills cross over so much. So a project that I did just in art really helped me figure out how to do this, unwinding an end band and rewinding an end band. Um, so in the next slide, um, and yeah, so the final little bit is that we see so many amazing, beautiful objects in conservation that we can't help but also be inspired artistically by them and want to try those techniques that we see. If it's a binding technique or a decoration technique, that certainly has its influence. So then switching over in the next slide to how book arts can affect conservation, the two main things that I would pick out are, when you study book arts or book binding at a trade school, any of that, you develop a connoisseurship of materials and you get a practical experience with materials and processes that really benefit you later in conservation. You pick up hand skills. In the next slide, um, in training and in practice, book conservators will make models of historical binding structures in order to understand and recognize the architecture and behavior of objects and collections that they're working with. So it's also a good practice to do this kind of work to gain experience and practice with specific techniques that you just improve your skills on. And this also improves not only your hand skills, but your critical eye for detail and quality. So that's that for that, and I'll move on to kind of theoretical problems you would encounter in performing conservation, treatment, and maybe preservation on artist books themselves. So in general, I would say once you're confronted with an object and you're going to do conservation treatment, it's not a very different approach to all other books that are conserved. You're confronted with all the same questions of materials, historical context, mending techniques, etc. But one main difference is that whereas many of the books that we work on, historical books, are generally kind of containers for information content, artist books can be viewed more as objects or artifacts, where their physicality and the physical manipulation of them and the connection between the user and audience and that object is kind of the main artistic purpose, not just accessing the words printed or written on the page. And then the next slide, I found these images of books that are reminiscent of a book that I was working on recently. So I'll just use these kind of as an example of books that have some really interesting object artifact value. To me, one of the most interesting conservation challenges philosophically is finding the appropriate balance between treating something to preserve and provide access to written information, and treating something to preserve the artifactual object. Preserving the information contained in the object as a manuscript or a printed book may require further intervention and dissection, whereas simply treating the item as an artifact requires us to consider more kind of less interventive preservation approaches kind of the many physical aspects of the object, sometimes even to the extent of retaining any eccentricities or alterations in the object as it currently exists. So it's really tricky to balance going in and accessing the information, but also not disturbing what the object is. There's valuable information from both of those perspectives, and so it's necessary to find where those two approaches overlap in treatment. So the goal in approaching objects like this is to maintain an authentic appearance that, on one hand, ensures physical stability and preservation, but also is in keeping with the character of the book's historical time period and acknowledges all the experiences and changes and many hands it has passed through. Yeah, the next slide, please. So this kind of all speaks to the differences between conservation, preservation, and restoration. And I just wanted to do my little plug on that. So in my view, conservation is really the physical treatment to save for the future, to slow degradation, to increase accessibility and usability, basically. Whereas preservation, I would say, is less intervention, and it's more managing an environment of an object for the same kind of purposes, to save for the future, to slow degradation, and to increase accessibility. And on the other scale, restoration is basically, in my view, to make it seem like new, and kind of permits the altering of original content and has less regard for the environment of the object and the slowing of the degradation. And I just bring that up because sometimes there's a little bit of a blur for people between restoration and conservation. I think it kind of has to do with aesthetics. So when I say accessibility in conservation, I think that includes making the original intent and aesthetic accessible to users. You don't want to just change over the whole thing and lose whatever effect the historical context was. So the skills and techniques of restoration can be modified and channeled and utilized in the context of conservation treatment, but only to avoid the obtrusiveness of a repair or avoid distracting from the rest of the object by hiding it to some extent, but not fooling the user. In conservation, we often refer to the 6 inches, 6 foot rule. And that's just kind of a basic idea, rule of thumb. If there's a piece of a painting missing, for example, and you in-paint to just fill in what's missing, when you're standing at 6 feet, you don't want to see it. You want to be tricked. You want to see the whole painting as it once was. But when you go up and look from 6 inches close up, you want to be able to see that. And that's just kind of an umbrella for the different ways that things can be seen. You can do special imaging to show the changes that you've made, as long as everything is documented and honest. I think some methods of restoration can be utilized. So that's just to say a word about that. So in the next slide. Sometimes it might seem that artists will kind of create problems on purpose. Not necessarily, but certainly artists are pushing the boundaries of what is feasible for the artists themselves and also feasible for the hypothetical future conservator or preservation expert. And it's interesting to explore challenging situations. Sometimes artists create an artwork without the intention of the object's longevity. They're just not thinking about whether the materials will survive. Sometimes artists create work that is intentionally unstable and will fall apart, will fail. And sometimes artists even create work wherein the actual degradation of the piece is what is considered the art. So I just picked up this example that I remembered, Zoe Leonard's Strange Fruit for David, where she just took peels of fruit and sewed them together and allowed them to decompose on the floor of the gallery. And it was an illustration or a comment on artists in New York in the 80s and 90s being lost to the AIDS epidemic. So it's just this all just to say, I don't have all the answers, obviously, but there are a lot of really tricky and interesting issues to consider in terms of conservation and preservation of more artist materials. And this is obviously an extreme case. It's not a book. I also just had another example that I'll mention. I don't have a photograph, unfortunately, but there's a really great book by the artist Keith Smith, and it's called String Book from 1982. You can actually find YouTube videos of the book being used, but it's an example of the experience of using the book physically being extremely important, and there's a preservation question there, because sometimes the one-time experience or the kind of the guaranteed breaking down of the item by using it is essential, and it's what's part of the book. So his book is kind of a pop-up book, and there's all sorts of strings bridging through holes in pages, and as you turn the pages, you get this miraculous opening up of structures, and the string is kind of sawing through the pages gradually. So, and that just leads me in the next slide to a project I worked on, a conservation project. Sometimes you will find evidence of the artist's process, and it's not necessarily intentional. It's not the artist's intention to have their process be what's interesting about the work, but in this case, the avant-garde artist Charlotte Mormon was working on this score, a musical score. It's hard to tell that it's music, but she was working on this musical score as a cellist and adding to it and changing it with all sorts of marks and tape and everything. And what really ended up being most interesting about this object is her evidence, the evidence of her process. And so often when we see tape in a book in conservation, that's a big problem, and that's kind of what we're trying to remove. But in this case, it's kind of the tape that's the most interesting part of her process and what we're trying to preserve. And another final possible difference between preservation and conservation of traditional or historical books and artist books is that many of the artists from our time can be communicated with about their work, and that's actually a growing trend in the conservation world, that people are doing a lot more artist interviews and trying to involve artists in the conservation process or the exhibition process, which is really exciting and kind of interesting. It raises some tricky issues for some places, but some people are really willing to work with the artist, and sometimes the artist is really willing to contribute an understanding of their methods and their intention. So in the next slide, this is a piece that I completed just a couple of years ago. It's just an example of some of the art that I like to do in book arts, where I really try to branch off and do more sculptural, non-traditional, non-trade binding, non-fine binding type of work. And in my art, I'm really challenging myself to accomplish constructions that at first seem impossible to me, simply for the sake of creating it and attacking that problem. I'm not really considering conservation issues, but once I complete projects like this, where I've actually bound a book entirely through the neck of a bottle without breaking the bottle, it's amusing and disturbing to think of future conservators manipulating this work and attempting to do something about it if it needs treatment or anything. In the next slide, There's just two more of my works that are also kind of pushing the boundaries of what we might want to do. I like to try to force a change in how the audience can approach the works, um, play with the reader's interaction and access. So this book with continuous sewing on the left, you can't open it. It has a continuous spine, and you'll never see the content in it. Or the book on the right, it's so small that you're really forced to change not only how you handle it, but how you just approach it as a reader, and can you even read it? Um, in the case of the piece in glass, and I have another piece that I'll show in glass. The glass presents the reader with some obstacles and obviously poses some inherent challenges for any future conservator. And in the next slide, this is just another example of how struggling with the physicality and of materials in bookbinding and sculpture really can inform your technique in conservation too. So balancing the tension in these strings was a great challenge, and there's just all sorts of little aspects of this project that I both learned from conservation and both allow me to treat materials more successfully later. And in the next slide, I just wanted to use that as an example of what do you do when you're confronted with an object, or is it a book? Is it an object or a book? As a conservator or a librarian or a curator. This is another piece that I bound inside glass. So this is Thomas Edison's patent for his light bulb that I printed and bound entirely through the opening in the bottom of this light bulb. And the next slides, you can just see a quick step-by-step, a little bit of the step-by-step of that happening. Really had to reinvent for myself one of the basic binding processes in order to make this happen. And so if the glass breaks, then what do you do? That's the kind of question that art conservators are confronted with all the time, and really this is a weird example for librarians or book conservators, but it's kind of the same basic question that we have in art conservation in general. Would you disbind the book and try to rebind it inside a new light bulb? Probably not, but a lot of these questions depend on, can you contact the artist? What is the funding available? What's the current owner of the work willing to do? I mean, could we blow a new glass light bulb around the original binding? More likely, I think we would create a new fake piece of glass that could just be put together in pieces around the original, and just be honest and admit that it's not the original and that you can probably see that it's not the original, but it really gives us an idea of what the original was like. And that's what we do a lot in conservation, is just we're not trying to pretend like maybe a restoration. In restoration you would. We're not trying to pretend that the binding or whatever it is that we're creating that's new is original, but it gives us a strong impression, an idea of that original. And in the next slide, I just quickly, you can see, if you want to see more of my odd bookbinding stuff, you can go to that link. And lastly, I just wanted to address some of the questions that I got before the talk today that I may not have answered already. So on the next slide, there's what kind of obstacles, as well as what things have really helped along the way in my career path. So fortunately, I wouldn't say that there have been many obstacles per se, but challenges. Certainly all the prerequisite coursework for getting into a conservation program, that's all very challenging, especially while working a job. There's a time investment, and and applying to programs and applying to internships it's very difficult and stressful, sure. But it's just a process that everyone who goes into the field goes through and eventually makes it through. But what I would say what helped in a big way, besides all of the wonderful people in conservation who are so supportive and really want to pass on their knowledge and help people learn, I would say is a certain attitude. So I think it's important to allow yourself to be wrong sometimes, to question your assumptions and to question what it is that you're accomplishing when you're trying to do something, and to be willing to learn. There's really no point at which you become an absolute master at conservation, and I suspect in other related fields. You're continuously learning throughout the field, continually learning and growing and changing. And I think that's tied to collaborating and learning from others. So always it's important to collaborate and brainstorm with others. Everyone has amazing ideas and solutions, including you. So value your own ideas and questions as well as the ideas and questions of your colleagues. Even sometimes in competitive small world of conservation, which it can be. So let's see, how did my education shape my career path from what I anticipated upon entrance to school? I already had a little bit of background in bookbinding, and my main interest in bookbinding was really the physicality and kind of sculpturalness of the books and mechanical functioning. That was really a fascinating thing for me. And so I was very interested in the possibility of objects conservation, because that really branches out into a whole other physical aspect. And I opened myself up to that, and I tried all of the different, as we were required to in the first year, I tried all of the different disciplines of conservation, and I thought about it hard, and I decided that I wouldn't be happy not working on books. So my experience in school really kind of confirmed what I was already hoping to do. One other important thing in school is at conservation school, there's a whole lot of science that is taught, and instrumental science on machines and microscopy, and I think mainly that was really important in order for us as conservators to be able to communicate well with conservation scientists and to understand the materials that we're working with. But I didn't really want to become a research scientist. I certainly had an interest in science and arts, and the conservation path is a really amazing combination of those two, but not to actually be a research scientist. So, what is the most exciting thing about my job? I would say that usually comes down to handling something very old and getting this exciting moment of connection with a different time and a different place and a person who is no longer here but who also handled that material. It really opens up that door in one way that other fields that involve history open up that door in other ways. So I think that to me is the most exciting thing, getting to really have an intimate experience and understanding of a material that other viewers of the material might not have the chance to do. Now, what role did my internships play in getting me my current position? I would say that they were quite important, and internships in the programs that I've gone through, the program that I went through and the other programs are required. And so it's just something that you do, but it's because they're important. You get a lot of experience of other people's different perspectives that you might learn from and agree with, you might disagree with and form your own opinions, but I think just the variety of approaches is really incredible and really informs your judgment. And So that helped me be a stronger conservator, and also just good to see on a resume that the various experiences that you've had. So, and what are the, I guess the next question is also about internships, and so that's speaks to the same thing. And finally, career opportunities and credentials for entry level, mid level, and advanced level. In conservation, there isn't really a large upward mobility structure. You, if you're going to be a conservator who works at the bench treating materials, that is, and if that's what you want to stick to, then that's what you'll do, and there isn't really a lot of upward movement. If you want to, later in your career, a lot of people will move to more senior positions within a conservation lab, and there's more management responsibility, eventually perhaps directing a lab or directing a conservation center if that's what you're interested in. But not necessarily. So, and then in terms of credentials, the professional institution that we are, the professional organization that we're all involved with, the AIC, the American Institution for Conservation of Artistic and Historic Works, there is a status that you can apply for, a professional status or a fellow status. So that is something that a lot of jobs will look for or hope that their employees will obtain. So those are the questions, and I just wanted to finish off on the last slide by reiterating the importance of collaboration and communication. So all the difficult decisions and challenges that I briefly described, I think are best approached by not just conservators, but these decisions should be made as a collaboration between everybody: librarians, preservation experts, collection curators, archivists, conservators, and even the artist or creator, bookbinder. Everyone really has to think about all these things and pitch in together, because no one person can make that happen alone. And no one person can decide what the real purpose of the conservation treatment or purpose of the object is. And the purpose and use of the object really dictate what needs to be done. And that is my material for today.
Thank you, Graham. That was excellent, and I'm sure a lot of our students will be looking forward to seeing the recording later today. So we just want to thank you again for taking the time out to talk to us about this. It's definitely an area that we don't have a lot of experience with in our schooling here, so it's a nice kind of look at another option for us. And we so appreciate you going through and creating this presentation for us. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And that is all for today, and I am going to end the session now. So I will be emailing you soon, Grant or Graham, and we will be in touch later. Thank you.
Okay.